It is that time where we introduce our illustrious, hardworking, world-conscious speaker. Richard Rothstein is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, which recovers a forgotten history of how federal, state, and local policy explicitly segregated metropolitan areas nationwide, creating racially homogeneous neighborhoods, ghettos, in patterns that violate the Constitution and that require remediation. He is also the author of many articles and books on race and education, which can be found on his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute. Feel free to look at our website for the web address for Mr. Rothstein's access for his materials. Previous influential books include Class in Schools Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reform to Close the Black and White Achievement Gap, and Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to some and introduce to others Mr. Richard Rothstein.
Thanks very much, Abra. And thanks to all of you for engaging with me in this conversation today. I can't help but mentioning that this is the first talk I've given on this topic in 2 years. The last one I gave was in Austin, Texas in March of 2020. And when I finished the talk, I got on my plane to go home, and when we were in midair, the pilot announced that Austin had just shut down. They'd canceled South by Southwest because of the pandemic, and I haven't been anywhere since. So thank you very much. By the way, I put on my, it's the first time I've worn a suit in 2 years, and I put it on here in the hotel this morning and looked in the mirror and saw that I have shrunk quite a bit since the last time I gave a talk. My doctor says, caution, continence will settle during shipping for people my age. So thanks for putting up with me. Let me begin by reminding all of us that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools, then went on to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. And then in 1954, as you all know, it persuaded the Supreme Court to prohibit legal segregation of elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists. They engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives in that struggle. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded much of the country, not everybody, as we know today, but pretty much persuaded much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful both to blacks and to whites, it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. And with that understanding, the civil rights movement persuaded Congress to abolish segregation in public accommodations, public transportation, employment. And then in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it succeeded in getting a Fair Housing Act passed that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But then the civil rights movement pretty much ended, went home, and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country, Milwaukee is no different, every metropolitan area of this country is residentially segregated. Clearly defined areas that are all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that are either all black or mostly black. How could it be? If we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with the idea of a democratic society, how could we tolerate continuing to live in an apartheid society? Well, I think partly it's because undoing residential segregation once we created it is hard. If we abolish segregation in buses, for example, after the Montgomery bus boycott that Rosa Parks inspired, if we abolish segregation in public transportation, the next day anybody can get on any bus, get on any train, and sit anywhere they like. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, Democrats, Republicans, we've adopted a national myth, a rationalization we give ourselves for failing to continue the civil rights revolution and leaving untouched this biggest segregation of all. And the rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of colleges and universities or schools or buses or restaurants, that was all done by government. If there was a law, an ordinance requiring restaurants to be segregated, that was in violation of the 14th Amendment, the civil rights violation, something we all have an obligation as Americans to redress, to fix. If the government was requiring African Americans to move out of non-segregated cars when a train crossed the Mason-Dixon line, that was a federal violation of the Constitution, a violation of the Fifth Amendment, something that we all have an obligation to fix. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, oh, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. That just sort of happened naturally, happened by accident. The reason we're residentially segregated is, oh, maybe bigoted white homeowners or landlords refuse to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it's because developers and banks and real estate agencies, all private sector businesses, discriminated in how they carried out their purely private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves, oh, it's just because people like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. That's why we're segregated. Or maybe we say it's all just the result of economics. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, not in every case, but on average. And so many African Americans can't afford to move to more expensive neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, discriminatory, private sector activities, self-choice, economic differences, this is what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We give a name to this rationalization that we have. We say that what we've got is de facto segregation, just something that happened in fact, not in law. Well, I spent, as you could tell perhaps from Abra's introduction, I spent much of my time before I wrote this book, The Color of Law, studying education policy and writing about education policy. I was not a housing expert, still not. Wasn't writing really about residential segregation. I was writing about education. And in the 1990s and 2000s, early 2000s, I was a critic of the dominant educational theory in this country. It was, again, broadly supported, both Democrats and Republicans, all across the country. We thought that the reason that black children achieved at lower levels on average than white children, we called it an achievement gap. The reason that black children achieved at low levels was because teachers were bigoted. They had low expectations of black children. They just didn't try very hard. And only if we could make teachers try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought this was a ludicrous theory, and I wrote article after article about it. I was a newspaper columnist at the time, denouncing the theory. Of course, there are some teachers who are lazy and don't try very hard, but that's a trivial cause of the achievement gap. The main reason for the achievement gap, the main reason we have an achievement gap between black and white children, is because so many African American children come to school with serious social and economic challenges that impede their ability to learn. And I remember writing one column in my newspaper column, it was in the New York Times, about asthma. As you may know, African American children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at about 4 times the rate of middle-class children. It's an enormous difference, 4 times the rate. And they have asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more trucks driving by their homes, more vermin in the environment, more dilapidated buildings. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who does not. Always I'm talking about averages, it's not true in every case, but a child with asthma is more likely than a child who is not to be up at night wheezing and then coming to school drowsy the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children, identical in every respect, same racial composition of the 2 groups, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group happens to have a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group's going to have lower average achievement simply because it's going to be drowsier in school. Now, asthma is not a big cause of the achievement gap, it's a tiny cause, but then you begin to think of all the other social and economic challenges that African American children from heavily minority neighborhoods come to school with. Asthma, lead poisoning. Lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ. Homelessness, economic insecurity, evictions. You add all of these up, and you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. Every one of these disadvantages, in one way or another, impedes the ability of children to learn. Well, I was writing column after column about this. I wrote a book, as you heard, called Class and Schools that explains the causes of the achievement gap. People used to make fun of me as being the toothache theorist of segregation because I explained that because African American children have such little access to dental care, routine dental care, compared to white middle-class children, many of them have toothaches, and that also distracts them during school. Well, it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic security or lack of dental care. It's another thing we have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges. How can such a school ever be expected, no matter how much you raise teacher expectations, how can such a school ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a middle-class school? Well, you can't. It's a ludicrous expectation. Nonetheless, we passed a national law called the No Child Left Behind law, which required that children be tested every year, that the scores be reported by race, and the law predicted that if you only did this, you would shame teachers so much they would work harder and the achievement gap would disappear. This was in 2021. It's really, even after 20 years thinking about this, it's incredible we could have passed such a stupid law. But, 20 years or more later, the achievement gap is still here. We're testing children ad nauseum, but hasn't had any impact on the achievement gap. The only thing that No Child Left Behind law ever accomplished was it got teachers to abandon a well-rounded curriculum and spend an inordinate amount of time drilling children in test-taking skills. Well, this is what I was thinking about back in that time, and I gradually realized that when you concentrate children in schools with all these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools, by the way, and schools are more segregated today than they have been at any time in the last 45 years. When you concentrate children in schools like this, the achievement gap cannot disappear, and the reason that they're concentrated in the schools like that is because the neighborhoods in which the schools are located are segregated. So I began to realize I'm a slow learner, but I began to realize that neighborhood segregation was the biggest educational problem we face in this country. And I began to wonder what we could do about it. Again, I was thinking about it as an education policy analyst. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated a program that 2 school districts had, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of these school districts had a very, very token school desegregation plan. They gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend, but if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, it wouldn't be honored. in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't do so. So you had an all-white, a mostly white school. Both a black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school. Black child be given some preference, help to desegregate the school. This was a trivial program. I mean, how often do you have one place left in the school and you have a black and a white child applying for it? But the Supreme Court evaluated this program, denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing. It was against the Constitution to do this kind of thing. The opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He explained, he said, yes, it's true, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. But he went on to say that the schools are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. It was a wise observation on his part. And then he went on to explain that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated de facto because of private bigotry and the discrimination by private companies and people wanting to live with each other of the same race and economic differences. And he said, well, you have de facto segregation, something that wasn't done by government. It's against the Constitution for government to fix it. Well, I read this decision, and I remembered reading about something that had happened in Louisville, Kentucky some years before. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in an all-white suburb of single-family homes called Shively. This white homeowner in the suburb of Louisville had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville, renting an apartment. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child. He had a good job. He wanted to buy a single-family home, but no real estate agent would sell him one. So the white friend living in this suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop that either. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition for having sold a home to a black family in a white neighborhood. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. The police, the courts, the entire criminal justice system, this is agents of state government. This is a blatant constitutional violation. Nothing de facto about this. And then I began to look into it further. And I found, and I'm not exaggerating here, there were hundreds and hundreds of cases nationwide, here, in Chicago, in Boston, in New York, and San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and Detroit, and Kansas City, everywhere. Police protected, sometimes even police-led and organized mob violence to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of them a constitutional violation. Every one of them giving the lie to the notion of de facto segregation. I then began to look into it further, and I found that there were many, many other federal, state, and local policies, racially explicit policies that were designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country, that the apartheid society in which we live is a government creation. Well, let me describe a few of these. I don't have a lot of time. I could talk for many years about this, and sometimes it seems like I have. But let me describe a few of the most powerful policies that the federal government followed in order to impose segregation on this society in an unconstitutional fashion that requires remedy. Perhaps the most famous of them, most well-known, is a policy that the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations followed in the immediate post-World War II period to suburbanize the entire white population into single-family homes like those I described outside Louisville, into single-family homes, and prohibit African Americans from doing the same. This was a racially explicit policy. At the time, we weren't a suburban country. The suburbs that we all take for granted now had barely existed in the immediate post-World War II period. Both whites and blacks, middle-class, working-class families were living in urban areas, in many cases in integrated downtown urban areas. We'd be stunned if we were transported back 60, 70 years ago to see the extent of integration that existed in some places. We were a manufacturing economy. Factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. So they had to be located in downtown areas, and the workers in these factories or in the banks that service them, or the other surface industries, needed to walk to work, take short streetcar rides. Automobiles weren't widespread at the time for working class, middle class families. And so you had downtown areas with both blacks and whites. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration embarked on a policy to move all the whites out of those areas into single-family homes in the suburbs and leave the African Americans concentrated there in urban areas. You've probably heard, well, they exist here in Milwaukee, these suburbs. They exist in every metropolitan area. Perhaps the most famous one nationwide is Levittown. You've probably read about it. 17,000 homes east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. The builder, William Levitt, wanted to buy the land and build these homes. No bank would be crazy enough to lend the money to do it. He tried. Banks turned him down. They thought this was a crazy idea. Who's going to want to live in a suburban community? The only way he could build this development, and the same thing is true of developers here in Milwaukee and in Chicago and in every other city of the country, the only way he could do it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, two federal agencies, submitting his plans for the development, the architectural design of the homes, the materials he's going to use, the layout of the streets, and a federally required commitment that he never sell a home to an African American. The federal government even required Levitt, and this is true here as well, and I'll mention a little bit later, some people are doing research here in Milwaukee about it. The federal government even required that Levitt put a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And those clauses still exist in these deeds today. Here in Milwaukee, they're not enforceable anymore. Here in Milwaukee, in Levittown, and everywhere in the country. This was a racially explicit policy of the federal government. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was a racially explicit written policy. The Federal Housing Administration had an underwriting manual that it distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of developers who wanted federal bank guarantees for their loans to build these suburban developments. The underwriting manual said that you could not approve, recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that was going to include African Americans. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even get a federal bank guarantee for an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. It's complete nonsense. There's no such thing. In my book, The Color of Law, that I guess you have a picture of here, some of you may have read it, you'll see that I have a photograph there of a project in Detroit, just outside Detroit, a white project that has a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that the Federal Housing Administration required the developer to construct to separate his development from a nearby African-American neighborhood. That's how explicit the federal policy was. Well, this policy created a white noose around every metropolitan area of this country, white suburbs surrounding black neighborhoods. The families who bought these homes in the mid-20th century with federal bank guarantees, with mortgages issued by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, these were working-class families. These weren't middle-class families. These were working-class families, returning war veterans. They had jobs in the post-war economy. Both blacks and whites had those jobs. Only whites were permitted to buy the homes. The homes at that time, in those dollars, cost about $8,000 apiece. In today's money, that's about $100,000, about twice national median income. Anybody with an income that's twice national median income can afford to buy a home for $100,000. Whites were subsidized by the federal government to do it. Blacks were prohibited. Well, today, as you know, those homes no longer sell for $100,000. Not here in the Milwaukee suburbs, not in Levittown, not anywhere in the country. They sell for $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The white families who bought those homes with federal bank guarantees didn't expect to get wealthy from buying those homes. They didn't know that the prices of those homes were going to rise. So these were, as I say, working-class families needing a place to live in the post-war boom, when there was very little housing constructed, private housing constructed, because the war had absorbed all construction materials. In the Depression before that, there was very little construction going on. So these whites who bought these homes, working-class families, then became wealthy because the homes appreciated in value. If they have a home that they bought for $100,000, and a couple of generations later, they or their children or grandchildren have homes worth $400,000-$500,000, that's several $100,000 in wealth that they accumulated through no fault of their own. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies, maybe temporary unemployment, maybe medical emergency. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from accumulating wealth in a similar fashion. On top of that, because the Federal Housing Administration would not insure mortgages for African Americans, even in African American neighborhoods in the urban areas, African Americans were exploited by speculators who charged them far more than the houses were worth, far more than they would have charged them, been able to charge them had the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration been subsidizing them. So African Americans simultaneously became poorer and poorer at the same time that whites were becoming richer and richer, all because of this federal housing policy. Well, that wealth gap continues to this day that was created by these policies in large part, not entirely, but in large part. African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes today. You would think that if African American incomes are 60% of white incomes on average, African American wealth would also be 60% of white wealth. You can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although African American incomes average about 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to this unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that's never been remedied, and that every one of us as Americans has an obligation, if we take our responsibilities as American citizens seriously, has an obligation to remedy. Well, that wealth gap creates, as I began by describing, the achievement gap in schools, because African Americans are locked into low-income neighborhoods where they have no opportunity to have the wealth that would enable them to purchase homes in higher opportunity areas. The wealth gap is responsible for health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, as you know, have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because they live in more polluted, more dangerous neighborhoods, less access to grocery stores selling fresh food. The wealth gap is also largely responsible, not entirely. I'm oversimplifying a little bit in this talk, but there's no way to do it otherwise. I would keep you to dinner if I didn't oversimplify it a little bit. But it's also responsible in large part for the mass incarceration of young African American men that is such a scourge on this country. Somebody interrupted to say women as well. That's true, but not nearly to the extent of young men. The young men are incarcerated at a much, much higher rate than women, and black men at a much higher rate than white men. And I'm not suggesting that no police officer would ever abuse a young African American if it weren't for the wealth gap. But when you concentrate the most disadvantaged young people in single neighborhoods where they have no access to good jobs, no access to transportation to get to good jobs, no access to schools, as I described before, that aren't overwhelmed with social and economic problems. It's inevitable that they're going to be engaged in confrontations with the police, that the police are going to adopt tactics of control that are typical of disadvantaged, disenfranchised groups in concentrated neighborhoods. The tactics of control the police use in this country and low-income black neighborhoods that results in our mass incarceration is similar to the tactics the colonial forces used in the 20th century in the Congo or India or any other of the colonial countries. And the wealth gap is also responsible for something else that's very, very dangerous and frightening to me, and I assume to you as well. And that is the enormous political polarization that we have in this country today. That's greater than any time since the 1850s, before the Civil War. And it's understandable. I mean, how can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that's needed to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to understand each other, no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to appreciate each other's life experiences? These are all the ongoing consequences today of federal policies followed in the 20th century to ensure that we be, as I said before, an apartheid society. Well, the policies of the FHA and VA are only one example. I think I have time perhaps to go into one other, and that's public housing. Public housing is something that we all, I think, misunderstand. Maybe some of you don't. Maybe you're smarter than I was. I misunderstood it before I started doing this research. We think of public housing as a place where poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children, lots of, as I said, young men without jobs in the formal economy. That's not how public housing began in this country. When public housing began in this country during the New Deal and the Depression, during the Roosevelt administration, poor people weren't permitted into public housing. Public housing was for working class families, middle class families, families who could afford housing, but who had no housing available because nothing was being constructed in the Depression. And the federal government built the first public housing in the 1930s in the history of this country for civilians. Of course, they always built housing on military bases, but the first civilian public housing was built throughout the country during the Roosevelt administration. And everywhere the Roosevelt administration built it, everywhere the New Deal built it, it segregated it, creating separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, frequently segregating neighborhoods. Remember I talked to you about before about how many neighborhoods in urban areas weren't segregated at that time. Segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated. I'm sure that many of you, I hope many of you, are familiar with the work of the great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes. Read his autobiography, The Big C. In his autobiography, he describes how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. It's not how we think of downtown Cleveland today. But he said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. It was an integrated high school in an integrated neighborhood. What else would you expect? The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and built two separate projects. One for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. And with other public projects elsewhere in the Cleveland area, contributed mightily to the pattern of segregation in Cleveland that exists still there today. And this went on all over the country. In my book, The Color of Law, I like to describe self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than you are. One of them, maybe you've heard of it, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half white and half black. The federal government built two separate projects in that neighborhood, segregating it for the first time and creating a pattern of segregation with that and other projects that persist to this day. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. There is no mystery about them. Policy experts, developers, politicians, journalists write about them all the time. We know what to do. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement, like we had in the 1960s, that's going to, in the words of the great late Congressman John Lewis, make some good trouble to insist that we take up our responsibilities as American citizens to redress segregation. I can give you a few examples of what those policies might look like. They're politically not feasible today without the civil rights movement. I mentioned those suburbs that were created by the federal government, where homes now cost $300,000 perhaps, and African Americans were excluded when they were affordable to them for $100,000. When homes in those communities come up for sale, the federal government should be buying them up at market prices and reselling them to African Americans at a deeply discounted price. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very explicit constitutional violation. If the courts did not willfully refuse to recognize the history of how this segregation happened, under our Constitution, they would have to accept such a policy. They won't accept it until there's a popular movement that demands that they accept it. We also, as you know, and I'm sure many of you deal with this, we have a program, two programs actually, two large programs that subsidize housing for low-income families, disproportionately African American, increasingly Hispanic in this country. The biggest one is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's a program that gives tax subsidies, the federal government gives tax subsidies to developers to build low-income housing units for families with low incomes who are disproportionately African American and Hispanic. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, both by its own regulations and by the inevitability of the conditions in which it works, disproportionately place those projects in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. That's nonsense. I'm not saying we shouldn't build low-income housing tax credit developments in low-income neighborhoods. Every neighborhood should have better housing. But to place almost all of them in low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation, and allowing suburbs to exclude them because they have zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of multi-unit structures is not only unconscionable, but it's also a violation of the Constitution because it perpetuates a segregation that was unconstitutionally created. The other program that we have that subsidizes the housing of low-income families, and you're all familiar with it, I'm sure, the Section 8 program, the Housing Choice Voucher program, also reinforces segregation, doing the opposite of what it should, because most Section 8 vouchers are usable only in low-income neighborhoods. They're usable in low-income neighborhoods because that's where landlords will accept them, because the way in which the voucher amount is calculated, it's based on an area-wide average, metropolitan area-wide average usually, or the average within a housing authority's jurisdiction, and the voucher is too little to afford rentals in high-opportunity neighborhoods. It's actually too much to afford housing in low-income segregated neighborhoods, and landlords typically exploit the program by charging more than the market would otherwise bear because the housing voucher is based on this area-wide average. That would be an easy thing to fix if we had the political will to do so. I'll mention in a minute somebody who's trying to fix it here in Milwaukee, but this is another area that will not change unless there's a popular movement that demand it. Well, I have the privilege of working with a group of national civil rights leaders who are at this point attempting to create something they call the redress movement, that's, whose role will be to organize or attempt to organize movements of activists, biracial movements of activists, whites and blacks, who are willing to undertake the hard work of creating mass movements to demand policies to redress segregation that, as I say, are constitutionally required. In conclusion, I want to introduce a couple of friends of mine who are here tonight who are working with that redress movement. One is Corey Perugini, whom I'm sure many of you know, who is on the national board of the redress movement. And we all wish that she and her colleagues have great success in doing this. And another is Reggie Jackson, who's on the local Milwaukee staff, whom you also know as well. Reggie, do you want to say something for a minute?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you all for being here. Just very quickly, the Redress Movement is a national organization They're launching in 3 cities, Charlotte, Denver, Milwaukee. I'm part of the research team. We also have a digital organizing team and a community organizing team that will be doing work in Milwaukee. If any of you are interested in learning more about the redress movement as we're beginning the process of doing the work here in Milwaukee, myself and my colleague Brittany, if you could raise your hand. We have a clipboard that we'll be passing around. If you want to give us your information, you can get on our list, our email list, and we can send you information about what Redress is doing. We're really happy that this work comes out of Richard's book. Just a big fan of the fact that we need to get people collectively to do this work. We've been waiting for the change to happen. Let's be the change we want to see. So thank you.
Thank you, Reggie. And finally, I want to introduce a mentor of mine, someone who has inspired me in doing this work. She's here with us today. Tanika Johnson has created 2 things, and write this down. One is called the Folding Map Project. It's foldingmapproject.com, one word. And the other is Inequity for Sale. It's also Iniquity. Inequityforsale.com. She's an artist, and she's from Chicago and has a lot to teach us here in Milwaukee. The Folding Map Project, the Folded Map Project, has brought together whites and blacks from white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods to begin the process of getting to know each other, which is an essential first step in creating a biracial movement to redress segregation. And you may recall that I mentioned in my talk that because the Federal Housing Administration would not issue or guarantee mortgages to African Americans in black neighborhoods, African Americans were exploited in a contract sale system in which they paid far more for homes than they would have paid if they were able to get legitimate mortgages, and frequently with contracts that were exploitative and dishonest and left them with nothing if they were evicted from homes that they thought they had bought. Tanika is in the process in Chicago of putting up land markers in front of these homes to advertise to people who walk by the history, and it has something they call a QR code. Is that what it's called? Yeah, you put your thingamajig on it, and you can learn the whole history about this. Tanika, would you stand up and just say hello? So I urge all of you to go to her websites and learn more about this, excuse me, and think about what you might do similar in Milwaukee. With that, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and good luck to all of you. Thank you.
For a few questions. We will not take longer than 10 minutes because we want to give the wait staff time to clear the table so that we can advance the rest of the presentation. So if Chantel, if you can raise your hand. We have mic runners in the room that will come to you with your question. Chantel, do you need another mic runner? Our mic, thank you so much.
Okay, definitely appreciate you coming and speaking. I want to get right to the chase. I can say personally, I want to see the people go to jail. You mentioned that this is a violation of the Constitution. I don't know how many lawyers are here, but it seems to me that people need to go to jail. This is something that when we talk about a civil rights movement, the civil rights movements began from legal action. Legal action cost a lot of money, so they needed promotion, so they got more people out to get things going. As you mentioned, it started out in legal schools. Again, that it needs to be a legal action. Where are our legal teams to address this? I don't care for lawyers personally in Wisconsin, but that's a whole other issue. But where are the legal teams to deal with the things that you clearly said was a constitutional violation?
That was a statement. I'll take a question as well.
Got it right here. Oh, but I think she just, oh, go
Well, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund does a lot of work challenging policies of segregation, but as I said, unless there's a political movement alongside it, it's not going to succeed in advancing us very far in this area.
You're saying that the political movements hadn't begun with legal action? And my assessment is incorrect in history.
They were complementary. They were complementary.
Before people marched, they were suing.
Excuse me?
Before black people or people were marching, they were suing in the courts.
Well, and not very successfully.
But it built the foundation for what we have today.
All right.
Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Hassan from Zion Benton Township High School District. I'm the Director of Equity and Engagement there. And I just wanted to thank you all for putting this program on today. And thank you really, I'm sorry I don't have a question, but I just had to say thank you for writing this book because there were so many questions I had. Or my father worked for the Department of Housing and Urban Development for over 30 years. And so there were so many things with me being involved in education and him being involved in housing that this book explained for me. And I just want to say thank you for being willing to tell the truth about what happened. And I don't know if it's a forgotten history. I think it's more of a hidden history, but it definitely answered questions about what happened. So I just wanted to thank you for that truth.
Well, may I comment about that? It was not hidden. Everybody who, for example, bought a home with a deed that said that they could not resell it to an African American knew it. Everybody who lived in a public housing project that was segregated by race knew it. So this was not we've forgotten it because it's hard to deal with, and we'd rather not think about it. But in the mid-20th century, everybody knew that the federal government and state and local governments were perpetuating segregation.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Bianca Shaw, and I live here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm here representing the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families today. And my question, I want to first say thank you for your presentation, and I think my question goes to the allyship that I do in my advocacy work in regards to First Nations and tribal nations. I really feel that the barrier to liberation of African Americans in this country is also brought about because of the divide and the lack of communication that we have with our tribal nations. And so I'm wondering, is there any type of discussion and understanding that that is something separate and different? But I do think that it's important to understand the connections that our tribal nations have to the African American experience within our country, and understanding how we can understand what happened to them, what is happening to us, and link that to make sure that it's fixed. Because ultimately, when I think about, my 40 acres, I think back, that 40 acres didn't even belong to those individuals who stole it from the Native Americans. So even if we are able to come to a place where we can have African Americans gaining the generational wealth through housing, what does that mean for our Native American brothers and sisters, and how do we begin to have that conversation so that it is all inclusive of all of the crimes, because these are crimes against humans in this country and the continuing of the dehumanization of the African American. So that was the question. I wanted to know.
Oh, well.
I'm sorry. So I want to know. I know that there's not a lot of research in regards to Natives, African Americans, but how does that come into play? Because for me, 30 years from now, I'm 40, and so I don't want to, be working at this, another 40 or 80 years, right? And so I'm thinking that the connection with Native Americans and African Americans is so very important, because our United States government, as long as we keep that separate, our United States government will never have to be held necessarily accountable by law. So in your opinion, how do we, or should we, I'm going to ask you, maybe you think we should not collaborate or have those discussions, but for me, and thinking about 30 years from now, I still think that when advocating, we do have to consider our tribes when we're doing this work.
No, of course I agree that it's connected. We have a history of discrimination, exploitation, and sometimes violence, extreme violence in the case of Native Americans. We have a history of state-sponsored discrimination against Hispanics, against Asians, and all of those need to be addressed. Nobody can address all of them at once. I wrote this book on a narrow topic, which is how metropolitan areas came to be racially segregated. And I look forward to reading your book about the history of the exploitation of tribals, peoples.
Hi, my name is Shawnee Malone. I work for SDC. My question is this, because I personally experienced this. My parents in '76, they bought a home in Bayside, and we were one of 2 black families that lived there, and we constantly went through a lot of drama, having our yard burned with a cross on it, being judged because they wanted to know why my parents would come live out there, and it was a predominantly Jewish area. But my question is this, going forward, especially with a lot of things that were implemented by the governor, but not the governor, the government is still ran by the same people. And I understand we have to vote at the local level, to make change. However, a lot of people think there won't be any change. So it's like, how do we be solution focused? What do we do from now? Because this is like on and on and on. So where does the change come from? Where do we start? So this won't continue to be like this.
Well, as I said, I think it won't come unless there's a popular movement. If you think it's hard to see how we can make change today, try to imagine how hard it seemed when I was young, when we had segregated restaurants and segregated restrooms and segregated lunch counters and segregated buses. It seemed impossible. When I was young, I'll tell you this one quick story. When I was a young man in my early 20s, this was in the early 1960s, I had a job as a researcher and a research assistant at the Chicago Urban League. And my job, one of the research tasks that I had, was to go through, there was no internet in those days, so you had these great big giant manuals that were directories of every company in the city of Chicago. And it listed the telephone numbers if you wanted to reach any executive. Anyone from the shipping and receiving manager to the personnel director. We didn't have human resources in those days. They were personnel directors. Any executive. And I had to count up the number of these positions. I counted up in the private sector of Chicago, there were some 4,000 supervisory executive level positions. And I had to identify how many of them were occupied by an African American, how many of these 4,000. So how many do you think there were? Huh?
None.
Zero. Zero.
None.
Zero. None.
None.
Now, if you had told me, well, I was probably too young and unsophisticated to understand, but if you had told my research director, my boss, that in just 15 years, you couldn't have a corporation in Chicago that didn't at least have some, at least mid-level executives who are African American, he would have said, you're crazy. That can't happen for several generations. Well, it did happen, and it happened because we had a civil rights movement in this country that changed the way we had to respond. So I agree, it looks impossible now. It may look impossible 10 years from now, but the only way we can make it possible is by stepping up to the task and making it possible.
It's funny that I didn't get the young lady's name. Shauna made that distinction because because I want to talk about the racism and the systemic racism in policy and procedure, and that kind of correlates to what she just said and what you just spoke on. When she said, "Well, when are we going to see the change?" We just keep talking about it. Well, there's racism and racial barriers and policy and procedures all the way around. Don't get me started on this topic. But yeah, there's racism and policy and procedure. When are we going to see the change? When?
Only you can answer that question when you make it happen. I can't predict.
We're down to our last 2 questions. We have one over there, and the last one will be over here. 2 minutes. I seem to always get the 2-minute warning. Look, I don't know everywhere I go. But I don't know if it's too loud. But you shared something that I've been thinking about a lot, about the federal government creating segregation. Like, in so many words, how could we ever think of like being one community? You know what I'm saying, with the federal government separating us. And I always felt like the only time that we have a shared identity as Americans is when we overseas. Now we overseas, we American, you know what I'm saying? Everybody love the flag, but once we get back, once you get on the plane to come back, hey, we separate. And I was listening to this historian, and he said there's never been a group of people who were slaves, and once they threw off the yoke of slavery, stayed with their enslavers in that community. And he don't know, as far as American and slavery, like how long would it take for us to have like a shared identity, you know what I'm saying, as Americans. So we don't have a shared identity, you know what I'm saying, just period. Like, would it take 100 years, 200, 500, and with these policies that's set by the American government, right, I have no answer to this question. What about you?
Well, I think you did have an answer to that question. You started off with it. The military is the one non-segregated institution in American society, and it works. People work together, and they see that each other are human, and they wind up getting along with each other. And as I said before, it's impossible to conceive of how we can have a common national identity if we're living so far apart and so separate and never have any interaction with each other, except in you know, servant relationships or employee relationships or employer relationships. That's why I recommend to you, as I did before, and I hope you will, you'll look at foldedmapproject.com, because it's an effort in Chicago to begin to bring whites and blacks together to dismantle the stereotypes they have of each other. And it can happen as well, but the military is the proof that it can work if only we make it do it. We decide to make it happen.
All right, last question.
Hi there, my name is Max. I'm an MPS high school student, and I was actually wondering if you have any advice for this next generation who's trying to fight against the achievement gap. I know I'm very interested in dedicating my life to fighting against the achievement gap, with one of my parents being an educator who also is devoting her life to that. And I was wondering if you have any advice for this upcoming generation who's looking to fighting against the achievement gap.
Well, I don't have any advice for you myself, but as I said, we need a movement here in Milwaukee as well as we do everywhere to begin the process that you're talking about. And Reggie Jackson offered to take your name and contact information if you want to be part of a movement to do that. Thank you very much.